In this short punctuation lesson, we're going to take a look today at semicolons and colons. Semicolons is that mark of punctuation that has a period with a comma underneath, that mark of punctuation that people look at their keyboard and frequently have no idea how to use it. So today we're going to talk about how to use that semicolon. And then we're also going to take a brief look at colons, which you're probably pretty familiar with, but we're going to take a look at them just in case. Okay, so let's start with semicolons. Let's look at our first rule for semicolons. Use a semicolon to join related independent clauses that are not already joined by the conjunctions and, or, nor, for, but, so, or yet. So let's break that rule apart. First of all, independent clauses. If you remember back to our comma lessons, you should remember that an independent clause is basically a clause that can stand by itself as a sentence. It has a subject, it has a verb, it could be standing alone and be a perfectly fine sentence. In our comma lesson, we joined independent clauses with those coordinating conjunctions. Remember fanboys? And the coordinating conjunctions are listed there on the screen for you. There is another way, though, to join these independent clauses without using one of those conjunctions, and that's to use a semicolon. So basically, you don't use the conjunction, you take that out, and you put the semicolon in its place. You can also add a little bit of filler information too, just to make your sentence more complex, but you don't necessarily need to. Important when we're looking at this rule to understand that the two independent clauses, the two sentences that we're joining with a semicolon, have to be closely related in topic. And I mean closely related. We're talking brother and sister related, not cousins related. If they're not closely related, we cannot use the semicolon. So let's take a look at the example here on your screen. Let's first look at the two independent clauses. The fire began with a tossed match. Jamestown was burned in 1676. So first let's look for relationship. We can obviously see these two sentences are very closely related. The fact that Jamestown was burned was a direct result of that tossed match. So these sentences are closely enough related that we can think about using a semicolon. Okay, so let's look at what that looks like with a semicolon. The fire began with a tossed match, semicolon. In that one moment in 1676, all of Jamestown began to burn. Now, you'll notice that we did a little bit of rephrasing with that second clause. In that one moment in 1676 helps bring it back to the first sentence of the tossed match. So that's why we've added it in there, just to make sure that the reader understands that direct connection. Okay. Notice we could have joined these two sentences with a conjunction. We could have said, the fire began with a tossed match, comma, and Jamestown was burned in 1676. This is just another way to do the same thing. We don't always want to keep combining with conjunctions. It gets really stale and old in your writing. And so semicolons are just another way to add variety to your sentence structure. Okay, so that's the first rule. Let's look at the next semicolon rule. Rule number 2. Use a semicolon to join independent clauses separated by either a conjunctive adverb or a transitional expression. Okay, so first let's look at conjunctive adverbs and transitional expressions. And it may be a very good idea to pause this video here and write these two lists of words down in your notebook so that they're nice and handy for you as you write. Okay, so let's look at the conjunctive adverbs. Also, besides, furthermore, however, indeed, instead, moreover, nevertheless, otherwise, then, therefore, and thus. And then we also have these transitional expressions, and they do just what they say they do. They help us transition or move from one thought to the next. As a result, at this time, consequently, first, for instance, in fact, on the other hand, second, that is. So let's take a look at an example of what this looks like. We were very impressed with the child's knowledge of history. Indeed, there's one of our conjunctive adverbs. She was remarkably well informed about the first English settlement. Okay, so let's first look. Okay, we were very impressed with the child's knowledge of history. That can stand by itself as a sentence. She was remarkably well informed about the first English settlement. That can stand alone as a sentence. Okay, so we've kind of crossed the first thing off of our list of things to look for when joining with a semicolon. We've used the word indeed, which is a conjunctive adverb. Okay, there's another thing to look for use for a semicolon. So that does mean I can use that semicolon after the word history. The second independent clause, very closely related. The fact that she's well informed has to do with why we were impressed. So direct connection between these two sentences. We've used a conjunctive adverb, and so we can go ahead and we can use that semicolon. Third semicolon rule is probably the easiest, and this is to consider the use of a semicolon to avoid confusion when independent clauses or items in a series already contain commas. And the best thing to do here is look at the example. Three important dates in Jamestown history are April 30th, 1607, September 10th, 1607, and January 7th, 1608. With dates or with cities and states or cities and countries, we are already using commas to separate pieces of information. So then, when you create a list of those items, it starts to get a little bit confusing for the reader because remember, commas provide breaks, but now we have commas all over the place. So instead, we can choose to use a semicolon. So April 30th, 1607. That's the first piece of information. Semicolon. September 10th, 1607. Semicolon. Okay, so basically what the semicolons do with this rule is they take the place of a comma we would have used, but we're using the semicolon because we already have a bunch of commas in there, and it helps to further separate it. Okay, so those are our three semicolon rules. Let's very, very briefly take a look at the colon. Excuse me. Colon rule number one. First of all, remember the colon are the two dots on top of each other. Use a colon before a list of items following an independent clause. So, important piece about this, and this is where I see a lot of errors, you have to have an independent clause before your colon. You have to have what could be a complete sentence before your colon. You can visit these historic places in Virginia. That can be a complete sentence. So now I'm okay to use a colon because I'm going to then list my historic places next in my sentence. The Jamestown Archaeological Laboratory, Jamestown Festival Park, and James Fort. You have to double check when you have the colon if there's a complete sentence before it. If there's not, don't use the colon, just list the items. If there is a complete sentence, though, you can use the colon and then list the items. And the second colon rule, and this is probably where you've used colons the most often, used to indicate time with numerals, to end salutations in business letters, and to signal important ideas. So, in basic time, you've used colons all the time. You've learned that from when you were really little, probably. Salutations in business letters, so that's when we say, Dear so-and-so. A business letter is more formal than a friendly letter, and so we use the colon there instead of the comma, which is what you may have learned in the past. And labels like, Notice, shop is closed for repairs. You'll notice that I use colons all the time here. I have one after numerals giving the time. I have one after salutations in business letters. That's because those things are labels. It's used to separate the label from the actual information. Okay, so hopefully you understand a little bit more at this point about semicolons and colons. If you're confused at all, please make sure that you come and see me. Semicolons are probably the trickier of the two, so if you're struggling, again, make sure that you stop in and we can go over them again.